Welcome to my world history, where I'm reading from the book I wrote to teach homeschoolers. A Bible Believer Looks at World History. You can purchase it on lulu.com, amazon.com, or at the Bible Baptist Bookstore, or just follow me here. I'm going to try to do the entire book. So it goes up to like the end of World War II. So we're talking about Assyria, and we were in toward the beginning of the first millennium BC, 1000 BC, in that range, right, 1000 to 500 BC. So now we're going to go on and move on during this time to China and India. Then we'll get to Africa, and we'll keep going. So just bear with me, and I'm going to pull up my book. And now, tradition states that while in prison, one of the founders of the Chu dynasty in China, Wen Wang, wrote the Book of Changes, or I Ching. The book is still used, and I used it in high school. The I Ching is a book of divination, a pagan satanic book based on what the Chinese call the Eight Kwa, or mystic trigrams, invented by the legendary Emperor Fu Shi. These trigrams are identified with the laws and elements of nature. Each trigram consists of three lines, some continuous and representing the male principle, or yang, some broken, representing the female principle of yin. Yang represented the positive, active, and heavenly principle of light, heat, and life, while yin represented the negative, passive, and earthly principle of darkness, cold, and death. You would think that neither Fu Shi nor Wen Wang had much of a liking for women, wouldn't you? Wen Wang doubled the number of strokes and raised the possible number of combinations of the broken and unbroken lines to 64. All science and history were supposed to be found in that book. All knowledge even was to be obtained in it. Confucius, the most famous of Chinese philosophers, edited a volume and declared that it ranked above all of the writings. Wen Wang's work allegedly took place in the early 12th century BC. The Shang dynasty, under which Wang may have been imprisoned, would have ended at that time, or a couple of hundred years later, around 1050 BC, depending on who you read. Both Shang and Chu dynasties used horse drawn chariots, organized armies, and human sacrifice as a means of governing and religious expression. Ancestor worship was very important. Remember, where all people are moving out from the center. So all people are carrying with them the same religious impulses. Ancestor worship was very important, and gifts of food and wine were brought to special places and temples to keep the ancestors happy. The Shang used oracle bones, which they called dragon bones, to communicate with their ancestors by heating them until they cracked and then reading the cracks. Remember, even in the ancient Near East, there was a sort of backhanded ancestor worship, as even the main gods of Assyria can be traced to Noah's sons or grandsons. Ashur, Genesis 10. Not surprisingly, the rich lived in large palaces, drank out of bronze cups, and were buried in lavish tombs, while the poor lived in squalor and poverty. The peasant farmers lived in thatch roofed huts with mud walls in winter, and in bamboo huts near the rice fields in the summer. Disease was rampant due to always working, standing in water in the rice paddies. In spite of the rampant die offs from various plagues, I want to say it again, a truth that confuses historians and epidemiologists alike. And I refer to William Neal's classic, Plagues and Peoples. There seems, from a secular point of view, to be a dynamic between the environment and human beings that allows them to resist disease organisms up to a point where an epidemic sweeps through a country or a new disease organism is introduced. Rapid population growth is amazing considering the hazards that face humanity. Remember, most of the great medical breakthroughs of today don't affect the billions who live in poverty at all, as they are only affordable for a few, relatively speaking. This is another reason not to believe in evolution. Under the most primitive conditions of the last 4,000 years, population has grown exponentially. And presumably, if these disease pathogenic conditions existed alongside of human beings for tens of thousands of years, or even hundreds of thousands of years, we would have had 5 times the population we have right now, with those that would die in hideous plagues being rapidly replaced. Stored ice by refrigeration for future use. By 700, they were keeping records of comets, meteors, and meteorites. In 1057 BC, or possibly 1027, the Battle of Mu Yu took place in southern Hunan area of China, in which Wu Wang, the king of Chu, defeated the Shang dynasty. Chu Kong, who assumed the kingship upon his death, put down the final Shang rebellion and established a governmental organization that lasted for nearly 800 years. The Chu expanded between 1000 BC and 900 BC, and after 800 BC, gradually declined. The Chu began to break down into fighting among 140 autonomous warlords, 7 of which were important: Qi, Qin, Jian, Wu, Yue, Song, and Qiu. An interesting thing to note is that for a short period of time during the 8th and 7th centuries, warfare became more ritualistic than violent, with battles resembling more theater than actual bloody clashes. The Western Chu developed at CH apostrophe U, developed a military organization similar to our modern platoons, companies, battalions, brigades, divisions, corps, and army. In India, the formation of the Vedas takes place between 1000 BC and 500 BC. The Upanishads are written between 800 and 500 BC. The kings of the Vedic period of India often raided their neighbors for cattle, and like Ethiopia today, marriage was often the result of forcible abduction of the bride or her purchase by mutual consent. Marriage by mutual consent was thought, however, to be less honorable and more of a compliment if the bride was stolen or purchased. The Rig Veda speaks of all of the perversions we encounter today: incest, seduction, prostitution, abortion, and adultery. But in general, there's a high moral standard between the sexes, and the family is very important. Women enjoyed far greater freedom in India during this period than in later times. Women could appear freely at feasts and participate in religious sacrifices. If she was a widow, there were no restrictions on her remarriage. She could study and engage in philosophic disputation, like the famous philosopher and composer of hymns Gargi. Other female philosophers and hymn composers of the time were Maitreya, Lopamudra, and Gosha. Vedic Indians bartered and ate cows, unlike today. They planted barley but knew nothing of rice, it would seem, at that time. There were no banks or alewives, as in Assyria, to lend money. Whatever you had was hid in your own home. Money itself was a late development, as bartering in cows and goods was the original means of exchange. Later, during the age of Buddha, credit developed. The Aryan invaders displaced the religion of the earlier residents, which is still found in places much like Aryans found among the Nagas. Animistic worship with totems and symbols, much like parts of Africa today. Serpents and dragons were divinity, and we can make the connection safely with Satan's religion spreading around the earth. Hanuman, the monkey god, is still worshipped, as is Nandi, the bull god. The earliest gods of the Vedic period were forces of nature, such as sky, sun, earth, fire, light, water, and sex, all good and evil spirits. We have the Atharva Veda, or the book of knowledge of magic. One must recite spells to obtain children, to avoid abortion, to prolong life, to ward off evil, to go to sleep, and to destroy enemies. In the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, formulas were given for forcibly seducing a woman by incantation. They remind one of the emerald tablet written by the Egyptian magician priest. Many of the Indian gods we know of today were, like the gods of Greece, local gods who had not assumed their all important universal power, such as Krishna, whom George Harrison of Beatles fame created a famous hymn to called My Sweet Lord, which fortunately, many young Christians who didn't listen to the lyrics carefully enough were deceived by. The language of the Vedic period was Sanskrit, which is labeled as one of the oldest of Indo-European language groups, although Hebrew is older and is perhaps God's language. It is probably the mother tongue of all languages. Sanskrit, Greek, Latin, and English all have some similarities in numerals and family terms. For instance, English 1, 2, 3, 4, and Sanskrit ek, dui, tri, and chatur sound similar, as do words for mother and father. The Sanskrit of the Vedas appears to be a scholarly tongue used only by scholars and priests. The word means, quote, prepared, pure, perfect, and sacred. Vedic script is still pictographic, and it isn't until the 8th and 9th century that merchants bring actual Semitic writing from the area of Israel that the, quote, Brahma script came to be developed, as did all of the later alphabets of India. For centuries, writing was confined to commercial and administrative purposes. Merchants, not priests, developed the art of writing in early India. Even the Buddhist canon does not appear to have been written before the 3rd century BC. The oldest inscriptions known were thought to have been done at the time of Ashoka, the Indian religious leader of the 200s BC. Nearly all the information that modern scholars have about ancient India comes from the Vedas. The word Veda means knowledge. The Vedas, though, are essentially collections of Hindu religious writings. The Upanishads, on the other hand, are more philosophy and psychology. The word comes from upa, near, and shad, to sit, as to sit near the teacher and learn. They consist of 108 discourses composed between 800 BC and 500 BC. The number 108 becomes significant in an occultic way through Indian martial arts that come to China and eventually Japan and are found in modern forms like the Way of the Samurai and Tai Chi Chuan. Later, Alexander would bring Greek pankration, a fighting sport, to India, which was then converted into a native art, Vajramushti, which was passed on to China and became Shaolin fighting, the father of Japanese martial arts. While Japanese, Chinese, and Indians will say that their unarmed punching and kicking combative arts developed on their own, we know that the first fighting styles indigenous to any ethnic group had to do with wrestling, rocks, and knives. Anyway, the theme of the Upanishads is basically, why are we here? One clear teaching of this religious expression is that the individual soul will eventually go back into the impersonal soul of the universe. In other words, one thing you lose when you finally die in the long chain of reincarnation is your personal identity. On the other hand, the God of the Bible does not teach that you cease to become an individual when you die. The supreme God in this combination of religion and philosophy is Brahma in India, the creator, followed later by Vishnu, the preserver, and then by Shiva, the destroyer. The Hindu religion and its offshoot Buddhism have permeated our Western culture, much to the efforts of many celebrities, from the American Standard Version Bible translator Philip Schaff to the American actor Richard Gere, as well as the rock group The Beatles. We're going to talk about Africa and Mexico next time, and I appreciate it. Sorry about taking so long, but it was things I wanted to cover today, and I hope you get something out of it and makes you dig. And I will mispronounce things. You can look that up, study it, and come to your own conclusions. Thank you for watching.